I'm even more enraged, more just disgusted, and more convinced, now more than ever actually, that Nichol knew way more than she was letting on. We know that Nichol tried to delete as much as possible off of her phone before even going into this interview with the police.
I feel like this whole thing is just going to be crazy regardless of whether I give you my phone or not.
She also said that if she had known that Shanann was pregnant, she wouldn't have been with Chris in the first place. The FBI agent stops her for a second to press her a little bit more into what she meant by this, because obviously that could be a motive for Chris. Certainly, if Nichol found out that he was expecting a baby and she was threatening to leave him, that would be a motive for Chris to murder his family. So why is that happening here? Why on earth? Especially, not to mention, when there is clear motive as to why Nichol would want her boyfriend to do that so that they could be together, because he did have a baby on the way.
A pregnant mother disappears. 2 little girls vanish without a trace. And a husband stands in front of cameras pretending to beg for their safe return. But behind the scenes, investigators were already uncovering something disturbing. A secret affair, deleted messages, a 111-minute phone call, and a woman named Nichol Kessinger. For years, millions of people online have debated the same terrifying question. Was Nichol Kessinger simply the mistress of Christopher Watts? Or did she know more than she ever admitted? Because the deeper people looked into the case, the stranger the timeline became. Phone pings near Frederick, Colorado. Internet searches connected to Shanann Watts. Messages deleted after the murders. And years later, people still believe there are details investigators never fully explained. Meanwhile, Chris Watts sits inside Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. Still changing his story. Still writing letters. Still blaming other people for the murders of Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and unborn baby Nico. Recent prison letters and pen pal interviews released in 2025 and 2026 revealed new claims about Watts' obsession with Nichol Kessinger, his disturbing fantasies, and his attempts to rewrite the narrative from behind bars. At the same time, internet communities on Reddit, YouTube, and TikTok began demanding the case be reopened. Some people believe investigators solved the case. Others believe the truth was buried the moment Chris Watts accepted a plea deal in Weld County, Colorado. Tonight, we're going through the timelines, the interviews, the phone records, the prison letters, and the theories that refuse to die. Welcome to Midnight Evidence. In today's case, we investigate the woman at the center of one of the internet's most controversial true crime debates. Nichol Kessinger. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from, because once you see the timeline for yourself, you may start questioning everything investigators said about this case. By the summer of 2018, Christopher Watts was living what appeared to be a normal suburban American life. He lived with his pregnant wife, Shanann Watts, and their 2 daughters, Bella Watts and Celeste Watts, inside a quiet neighborhood at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado. To the outside world, they looked like a happy family. Shanann posted smiling photos online. Videos showed birthday parties, vacations, family dinners, and pregnancy announcements. But behind closed doors, something was already beginning to change. On June 11, 2018, Shanann Watts publicly revealed she was pregnant with the couple's 3rd child, a baby boy they planned to name Nico Watts. In the video, Chris Watts smiles awkwardly as Shanann surprises him with the news. To viewers, it looked like the reaction of a normal husband. But investigators would later believe that by this point, Chris Watts was already emotionally disconnecting from his family.
You can run, but you can't hide. After 7 long years, Nichol Kessinger has allegedly been spotted. Now, for those of you who need a reminder of who Nichol Kessinger is, she is the infamous Chris Watts' mistress. Now, ever since this first went down in 2018, Nichol Kessinger has stayed off the radar. Some people even suggested that she entered the witness protection program because there was a lot of allegations floating around there that she was somehow involved in what Chris Watts did to his family. Not necessarily the act itself, but certainly knowledge of the crime and maybe even participating in the cover-up. And I actually did a deep dive on this because I went through her, 4 hours of interrogation, all of her phone records, and there was, in my opinion, a lot of stuff that lines up with her knowing more than she let on. Like the fact that whenever her phone would ping on the tower near Chris's home, those were self-admittedly times when she was at Chris Watts' home. Yet there was a ping on that same tower on the morning of the murders, and she claimed that she wasn't there. She also didn't clock into her shift at work until 3 p.m. that day, and even when she arrived, she was there, I think, less than an hour. She called her spiritual guru and then left. Some people also allege that she is seen on that footage. You can see the ponytail in the middle of the night when Chris is loading up the truck. But I'll link that whole deep dive and you can check it out yourself. Today we're talking about the fact that she has allegedly been spotted in Montana. This was allegedly at the funeral of her friend's mother, and I don't know if this camera was in a fixed position, perhaps live streaming the funeral, or if somebody held up their own personal device to catch this footage, but you can imagine the internet went into a full-on frenzy. And I did a little side-by-side work myself, and while it does look like with 7 years of age and being a woman, she's gained weight, the eyebrow arches look the same, the hairline, even the small little cowlick where it's parted a little off to the side, I believe this is Nichol Kessinger.
At Anadarko Petroleum in Platteville, Colorado, Chris worked as an operator servicing remote oil sites across Weld County, and sometime around June 2018, he met a woman named Nichol Kessinger. Nichol Kessinger worked in the environmental department through Tasman Geosciences, a contractor associated with Anadarko Petroleum. According to investigative timelines, Chris Watts first began speaking with Nichol casually inside the office, passing conversations, brief interactions, moments that initially appeared harmless. But according to later interviews and digital evidence, their relationship escalated quickly, and some investigators, as well as internet analysts years later, began questioning whether the relationship may have started earlier than publicly admitted. Coworker Anthony Brown later told investigators he had seen Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger standing unusually close together months before the murders. Online communities would later dissect every timeline, every message, and every interaction connected to the affair, especially after controversial discovery documents appeared to show alleged internet searches involving Shanann Watts and Chris Watts dating back to 2017. Those searches would later become one of the internet's most debated mysteries in the case. Some people believe they suggest prior interest. Others argue they may be clerical errors, misunderstood metadata, or context missing from discovery files. But regardless of when it truly began, by late June and early July of 2018, Christopher Watts and Nichol Kessinger were seeing each other regularly. And while Shanann Watts traveled with Bella and Cece to North Carolina for several weeks during the summer, Chris Watts began living what many later described as a second life. He went on dates with Nichol, visited museums, spent nights away from home, and according to investigators, became increasingly obsessed with the idea of starting over. At the same time, Shanann Watts was posting emotional messages online about saving her marriage. Text messages later revealed growing tension between the couple, financial stress, emotional distance, and arguments about the future. But Shanann reportedly still believed the marriage could be repaired. Nichol Kessinger, meanwhile, later told investigators that Chris Watts made her believe he was already in the process of divorcing Shanann. She claimed she did not know Shanann was pregnant until the disappearance became national news. And according to police interviews, Chris Watts allegedly told her he was close to finalizing the separation, but investigators would later discover none of that was true. Chris Watts was still living with his family, still sleeping in the same home, still appearing publicly as a husband and father. And while Shanann Watts was planning doctor appointments for baby Nico, Christopher Watts was secretly building another relationship behind her back. A relationship that would soon become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire investigation. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from, because what happened next would transform a secret affair inside Colorado into one of the most disturbing true crime cases in modern American history. As investigators continued examining phones, laptops, deleted messages, and digital records connected to the Watts case, a discovery buried deep inside the evidence files would eventually ignite years of controversy online. Internet searches. Searches that many people believe changed the entire timeline of the relationship between Christopher Watts and Nichol Kessinger. And even today, those searches remain one of the most debated details in the entire case. According to discovery documents reviewed by online investigators, A search allegedly connected to Shanann Watts appeared in connection with Nichol Kessinger as early as September 1, 2017. Months before the murders. Months before Chris Watts publicly claimed the relationship began. And months before Shanann Watts announced her pregnancy with baby Nico. Another alleged search involving Christopher Watts reportedly appeared on January 7, 2018. When these details spread across Reddit, YouTube, and true crime forums, people immediately began asking the same question. How could Nichol Kessinger search Shanann Watts before officially meeting Chris Watts? To some online investigators, the answer seemed obvious. They believed the affair started much earlier than publicly admitted. And according to those theories, Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger may have been involved long before June 2018. But others strongly disagreed. Critics argued the discovery documents may have been misunderstood. Some claimed the searches could have resulted from metadata errors, auto-filled records, or formatting inconsistencies inside the forensic extraction reports. And importantly, no investigator publicly stated those searches proved criminal involvement. But by this point, the internet had already become obsessed with the timeline. Every message, every deleted text, every Google search, every phone record, was now being analyzed by millions of people online. Meanwhile, Christopher Watts and Nichol Kessinger were continuing their relationship throughout the summer of 2018. During July, Shanann Watts traveled to North Carolina with Bella and Cece for a 6-week trip to visit family. And according to investigators, Chris Watts used that time to spend even more time with Nichol Kessinger. The two visited restaurants across Colorado, went on dates, talked for hours on the phone, and according to phone records, communicated constantly. Nichol later told investigators she believed Chris Watts was separated and close to divorce. But Shanann Watts' messages to friends painted a completely different picture. She described Chris becoming cold, emotionally distant, and increasingly disconnected from the marriage. At one point, Shanann reportedly told friends she felt something was wrong. She noticed changes in Chris' behavior, changes in affection, changes in communication, and changes in intimacy. But according to people close to the family, Shanann still hoped the marriage could be repaired. What she did not know was that investigators would later uncover evidence suggesting Chris Watts was already imagining an entirely different future, one without his family. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from, because the deeper investigators looked into Chris Watts' double life, the darker the timeline became. By July 2018, Christopher Watts was living two completely different lives. In North Carolina, Shanann Watts was staying with Bella and Cece while visiting family. But back in Colorado, Chris Watts was spending more and more time with Nichol Kessinger. And according to investigators, the relationship intensified quickly. Phone records later revealed constant communication between the two. Long conversations, late-night calls, thousands of messages exchanged over only a few weeks. To outsiders, Chris Watts still appeared to be a husband and father trying to hold his family together. But privately, investigators later believed he was emotionally separating himself from the life he already had. Nichol Kessinger would later tell police that Chris made her believe he was nearing the end of a divorce. She described him as quiet, calm, soft-spoken, and different from other men she had dated. Meanwhile, Shanann Watts was beginning to notice changes that frightened her. Text messages later recovered from her phone revealed growing concern about the state of the marriage. She told friends Chris no longer seemed affectionate. He barely responded to messages. He acted emotionally disconnected, and at times, completely cold. At one point during the North Carolina trip, Shanann reportedly confronted Chris about his behavior. But according to those messages, Chris insisted nothing was wrong. Behind the scenes, however, investigators later discovered Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger were going on dates across Colorado. They visited restaurants, looked at cars online, and according to reports, searched for vacation destinations. Nichol later admitted she searched wedding dresses online during the relationship. And according to investigators, Chris Watts spoke openly about wanting a new life, a fresh start. freedom. But there was one major problem. Shanann Watts still believed the marriage could survive. In August 2018, Shanann returned briefly to Colorado before leaving again for a business trip to Arizona connected to Thrive, the multi-level marketing company she worked with. Friends later said Shanann seemed emotionally exhausted, concerned, confused by Chris' sudden emotional distance. And while Shanann was trying to save the relationship, Chris Watts was becoming increasingly consumed by the secret relationship he had built with Nichol Kessinger. According to investigators, he was searching online for luxury apartments, discussing future plans, and imagining a completely different life. A life without the family he already had. What nobody around him understood at the time was how quickly everything was about to collapse, because in only a few weeks, the Watts family would vanish, and the entire country would begin watching Christopher Watts very closely. By August 2018, the tension inside the Watts marriage had reached a breaking point, and according to investigators, Christopher Watts was becoming increasingly distant with every passing day. On August 10, 2018, Shanann Watts flew from Colorado to Scottsdale, Arizona for a Thrive business trip with friends. Friends later described her as emotionally drained during the trip. She confided in several people about problems in the marriage. She told them Chris no longer touched her, barely spoke to her, and acted like a completely different person. But while Shanann was in Arizona trying to understand what was happening to her marriage, Chris Watts was back in Frederick, Colorado, still communicating with Nichol Kessinger, still living the double life he had carefully hidden for weeks. Investigators later discovered that on August 11th, Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger spent hours together. They reportedly visited the Lazy Dog restaurant in Erie, Colorado, and according to later interviews, discussed relationships, the future, and starting over. But what happened next would later become one of the most discussed details in the entire case. On the evening of August 12, 2018, just hours before Shanann Watts returned home from Arizona, Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger spoke on the phone for 111 minutes. Nearly 2 full hours. Late into the night. And according to both Chris and Nichol, neither could clearly explain what was discussed during the call. For years, that phone call has fueled intense speculation online. Some believe it was meaningless. Others believe it may have been one of the most important conversations in the entire timeline. But officially, no public evidence has ever proven the contents of the call involved criminal planning. Still, internet communities continue debating it to this day. Meanwhile, Shanann Watts was preparing to fly home to Colorado. She had no idea this would become the final night of her life. At approximately 11:09 p.m., Shanann boarded her delayed flight from Arizona. Back in Frederick, Chris Watts waited inside the Saratoga Trail home. And according to investigators, the events about to unfold would shock the entire country, because only hours later, Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts would disappear, and nothing about Christopher Watts' life would ever look normal again. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below, because what happens next changes everything. By August 2018, the tension inside the Watts marriage had reached a breaking point, and according to investigators, Christopher Watts was becoming increasingly distant with every passing day. On August 10, 2018, Shanann Watts flew from Colorado to Scottsdale, Arizona for a Thrive business trip with friends. Friends later described her as emotionally drained during the trip. She confided in several people about problems in the marriage. She told them Chris no longer touched her, barely spoke to her, and acted like a completely different person. But while Shanann was in Arizona trying to understand what was happening to her marriage, Chris Watts was back in Frederick, Colorado, still communicating with Nichol Kessinger, still living the double life he had carefully hidden for weeks. Investigators later discovered that on August 11th, Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger spent hours together. They reportedly visited the Lazy Dog restaurant in Erie, Colorado, and according to later interviews, discussed relationships, the future, and starting over. But what happened next would later become one of the most discussed details in the entire case. On the evening of August 12, 2018, Just hours before Shanann Watts returned home from Arizona, Chris Watts and Nichol Kessinger spoke on the phone for 111 minutes. Nearly 2 full hours. Late into the night. And according to both Chris and Nichol, neither could clearly explain what was discussed during the call. For years, that phone call has fueled intense speculation online. Some believe it was meaningless. Others believe it may have been one of the most important conversations in the entire timeline. But officially, no public evidence has ever proven the contents of the call involved criminal planning. Still, internet communities continue debating it to this day. Meanwhile, Shanann Watts was preparing to fly home to Colorado. She had no idea this would become the final night of her life. At approximately 11:09 p.m., Shanann boarded her delayed flight from Arizona. Back in Frederick, Chris Watts waited inside the Saratoga Trail home. And according to investigators, the events about to unfold would shock the entire country. Because only hours later, Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts would disappear. And nothing about Christopher Watts' life would ever look normal again. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because the next chapter changes everything. At 1:48 a.m. on August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts arrived home at 2825 Saratoga Trail in Frederick, Colorado. Neighbor surveillance footage later confirmed her return to the property. She walked inside that house for the final time. And after that moment, everything begins to fracture. By early morning, Shanann Watts had missed scheduled appointments. Her friends began calling her phone repeatedly. No response. No activity. No explanation. At 7:40 a.m., a co-worker and friend of Shanann, later identified as Nicole Atkinson, contacted police to report her missing. She told authorities something was deeply wrong. Shanann would never simply disappear. When officers arrived at the Watts home, they met Christopher Watts outside the property. Calm, composed, cooperative. He told investigators he had last seen Shanann when she returned home early that morning. But almost immediately, inconsistencies began to appear. Inside the home, detectives noticed signs that raised concern. Phones were missing. Personal belongings were still present. And the atmosphere did not match a voluntary disappearance. By mid-morning, Christopher Watts was speaking with police inside a patrol vehicle. This is where the public version of the story begins to change. He appeared nervous at times, but also unusually controlled. He repeated that he wanted his family back. He pleaded for them to return safely. But investigators later noted something critical. His emotional responses did not match the situation of a missing pregnant wife and 2 children. As the hours passed, search efforts expanded across Frederick, Colorado. Volunteers joined in. Flyers were printed. And the Watts family case began to attract national attention. But while the world believed this was a missing persons case, investigators were already beginning to suspect something far more serious. Because inside the house, nothing suggested a simple disappearance. And outside the house, Christopher Watts' behavior was becoming the center of attention. Every word he said, every pause, every inconsistency, was being recorded. And it would not take long before the entire investigation changed direction completely. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because what investigators discover next turns this missing persons case into something far darker than anyone expected. By the afternoon of August 13, 2018, the Watts family case had already moved beyond a simple missing persons report. But the public didn't know that yet. And standing outside 2825 Saratoga Trail, Christopher Watts was about to appear in front of cameras. What followed would become one of the most analyzed interviews in modern true crime history. He stood on the porch of his own home, speaking directly to the media, and pleading for the safe return of his wife and daughters. Chris Watts said he didn't know where they were. He said he just wanted them home, and he asked the public for help finding them. But behind the scenes, detectives were already noticing contradictions between his statements and the early evidence. His calm demeanor stood out, not because calmness is unusual in crisis, but because of how controlled and rehearsed he appeared under pressure. Inside the investigation, officers were already comparing his statements to early phone records, timelines, and behavior patterns. And the more they examined his responses, the more questions began to form. That same day, Chris Watts agreed to a formal interview with law enforcement. Inside that interview room, his story would begin to shift. But at this stage, he still maintained he was a worried husband searching for his missing family. Meanwhile, search teams across Frederick expanded operations. Volunteers, neighbors, and law enforcement worked together across open fields and residential areas. Flyers with the faces of Shanann, Bella, and Cece were distributed across Colorado. The case was still officially treated as a disappearance. But internally, detectives were preparing for a very different possibility, because the behavior they were observing did not match a man whose family had simply gone missing. And within hours, the investigation would shift again. This time, permanently. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because the next stage of the investigation takes us inside the interrogation room, where the truth begins to surface. Inside the Weld County Sheriff's Office in Greeley, Colorado, Christopher Watts was now sitting in an interrogation room, separated from the media, separated from search efforts, and now, face to face with investigators who were beginning to see cracks in his story. At first, Chris Watts maintained his original version of events. He said he woke up that morning. He said Shanann was gone. And he said he didn't know where she had taken the children. But detectives had already begun comparing his statements with early evidence. The timeline didn't align. His emotional reactions didn't match the urgency of a missing pregnant wife and 2 daughters. And his explanations began to shift under pressure. As hours passed, investigators introduced inconsistencies they had already identified. Phone records, neighbor surveillance footage, and discrepancies in his account of the morning. Chris Watts started adjusting his story, subtly at first, then more noticeably. He suggested arguments had taken place. He implied emotional tension inside the home. But still, he denied knowing where his family was. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, search teams were expanding across Frederick and surrounding Weld County. But inside the investigation, something else was happening. Investigators were no longer treating this as a disappearance. They were building a homicide theory. And Chris Watts was now the primary focus. At one point during questioning, detectives presented him with the idea that his family may not have left voluntarily. His reactions became more controlled, more measured, and increasingly inconsistent. But he still did not confess. Not yet. Over the next 48 hours, the interrogation intensified. Detectives returned again and again, each time pressing harder on contradictions, until finally, a critical tool was introduced, the polygraph examination, and everything was about to change. Because the moment Chris Watts agrees to take a lie detector test, the entire case shifts in a way nobody expected. By August 14, 2018, Christopher Watts had already spent hours inside the Weld County Sheriff's Office. But the pressure was about to escalate in a way he could not control. Detectives introduced the polygraph examination, a lie detector test designed to measure physiological responses tied to deception. Chris Watts agreed, and that decision would become a turning point in the entire investigation. Before the test began, investigators asked him direct questions. Where is your family? Did you harm your wife? Do you know where your children are? Chris Watts repeatedly denied involvement. But inside the room, investigators noted visible signs of stress. His breathing changed. His posture shifted. His responses became slower. And after the examination, the results were presented to him. Detectives told him he failed, that his physiological responses indicated deception. At first, Chris Watts attempted to maintain his original story. He insisted he was telling the truth. But the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The confidence he once held was beginning to collapse. Investigators later described this moment as the point where the psychological pressure became overwhelming. Not because of the test alone, but because everything around it was already unraveling. Phone records, timeline inconsistencies, behavioral analysis, and the growing suspicion that something had happened inside the home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. As questioning continued, Chris Watts began shifting his narrative again. This time, he suggested a confrontation inside the house, then implied something went wrong, then hesitated, and finally, stopped maintaining a consistent version of events altogether. He was no longer fully denying involvement in the disappearance, but he was not yet giving a full confession either. Instead, investigators were watching something more complex unfold. A controlled breakdown of his story, piece by piece, until the truth could no longer stay hidden. And what came next would turn the Watts case from a missing persons investigation into one of the most disturbing homicide confessions in modern American history. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below, because once the interrogation continues, Chris Watts begins to say things investigators were not expecting at all. By August 15, 2018, the interrogation had entered a new phase. Chris Watts was no longer maintaining a stable story. He was reacting, adjusting, and slowly losing control of his narrative. Detectives continued pressing him with the results of the investigation, the failed polygraph, the inconsistencies in his timeline, and the growing belief that Shanann Watts had never simply gone missing. At first, Chris Watts continued to deny direct involvement in harm coming to his family. But the pressure inside the room was constant. Hour after hour, question after question, until eventually, something changed. He began to speak differently, more cautiously, less confidently, and with increasing contradictions inside his own explanations. He suggested there had been an argument inside the home at 2825 Saratoga Trail, then implied emotional escalation, then hesitated when asked for specifics. Detectives noted that he was no longer holding a consistent version of events. And as the questioning intensified, Chris Watts began to introduce the first fragments of what would later become his confession. He admitted that Shanann Watts was no longer alive, but he did not fully explain how it happened, or when, or why. Instead, he gave partial statements, pieces of information, fragments that raised more questions than answers. Investigators would later describe this phase as the beginning of his psychological collapse under pressure, because every attempt to clarify his story only made it more unstable. Outside the interrogation room, search teams were still active across Frederick and Weld County, but the mission had changed. This was no longer a rescue effort. It was now a recovery operation. And inside the room, Chris Watts was still talking, still shifting, still trying to control a story that was slipping away from him. And the most disturbing details were still ahead. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below, because what Chris Watts reveals next about what happened at Survey 319 will change everything investigators believed up to this point. On August 16, 2018, investigators focused their attention on one location tied directly to Christopher Watts' work. Survey 319, an Anadarko petroleum oil site located deep in Weld County, Colorado. A remote industrial field filled with tanks, equipment, and open land stretching in every direction. It was the kind of place where silence feels heavier than sound. And that morning, search teams arrived with a very specific objective: to locate Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts. By this point, Christopher Watts had already begun revealing fragments of what happened inside the home. But investigators still needed physical confirmation. And what they found would permanently change the case. Shanann Watts was discovered on the property, hidden in a shallow grave. The confirmation transformed the investigation instantly. This was no longer missing persons. This was a homicide investigation. But the search was not over, because Bella Watts and Celeste Watts were still unaccounted for. Search teams expanded across the oil site, moving carefully between tanks and industrial structures. And then, inside separate crude oil storage tanks, they made a second discovery: Bella Watts and Celeste Watts, two small children, placed inside oil tanks at an industrial site operated in Weld County. The discovery sent shockwaves through investigators on scene. Even seasoned professionals described the moment as difficult to process. There were no words that could properly frame what had been found. Back at the Weld County Sheriff's Office, Christopher Watts was still in custody, and had not yet been fully confronted with the discoveries at Survey 319. But that would change soon, because once investigators returned to him with the confirmation, his story would collapse completely, and what remained was no longer speculation. It was reality. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because after what was found at Survey 319, the final version of Chris Watts' confession begins to emerge. After the discoveries at Survey 319, the interrogation room changed permanently. Because now, investigators were no longer asking what happened. They already knew. And Christopher Watts knew they knew. When detectives returned to him with confirmation that Shanann Watts had been found, his behavior shifted immediately. The calm control that he had maintained for days began to break. He stopped holding on to earlier versions of his story, and for the first time, began speaking in a more direct way about what had happened inside 2825 Saratoga Trail. He admitted that Shanann Watts died inside the home. He stated that there was an argument, and that the situation escalated beyond what he could control. But even in this moment, the details were inconsistent, fragmented, changing depending on the question asked. Detectives continued pressing him, and over time, the remaining pieces of his narrative began to surface. He acknowledged transporting the bodies to Survey 319. He admitted involvement in concealing what happened, and he eventually confirmed the locations where Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were found. But even with these admissions, questions remained, because Chris Watts never provided a fully stable explanation. His statements shifted slightly across interviews, and investigators documented inconsistencies in timing, sequence, and emotional detail. What stood out most to detectives was not just what he said, but how he said it: controlled, detached, and at times, emotionally distant from the gravity of his own admissions. As the final hours of interrogation unfolded, the case transitioned completely from investigation to prosecution. Chris Watts was formally taken into custody for multiple counts of murder, and the Watts family disappearance case officially ended. But for investigators, the story was still not simple, because even after the confession, the full psychological picture of what led to that moment remained the subject of analysis, debate, and public obsession. And that debate would only grow stronger in the years that followed. Subscribe to Midnight Evidence and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because even after the confession, people still argue about what Chris Watts did not fully explain. Chris Watts is in prison. The investigation is closed. The confessions were recorded, and the case was officially solved in a court of law. Christopher Watts was convicted of murdering Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, Celeste Watts, and unborn baby Nico in Weld County, Colorado. But even with a conviction, the internet never stopped asking questions. Because in the years that followed, one name continued to surface again and again in online discussions: Nichol Kessinger. Some online theories claim there are unanswered questions about the timeline of messages, phone activity, and the early stages of the investigation. Others argue that these claims are based on speculation, misinterpretation, and selective reading of public documents. What is confirmed is that Nichol Kessinger cooperated with law enforcement, gave multiple interviews, and was never charged with any crime. Investigators publicly focused their case entirely on Christopher Watts. But the internet did something different. It built a parallel investigation. Reddit threads, YouTube breakdowns, TikTok theories, body language analysis, and timeline reconstructions that continue to circulate years later. Some viewers believe there are inconsistencies that still deserve discussion. Others believe the case is complete, and that the internet has overanalyzed already explained events. And that is where the case now exists. Not just in court records, but in public debate. Because the Chris Watts case is no longer just about what was proven. It is about what people believe still feels unresolved. And as long as those questions exist, the discussion will continue. So we leave you with this final question. Do you believe the Chris Watts case is fully understood? Or do you believe there are parts of the story that the public may never stop questioning? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this investigation, subscribe to Midnight Evidence for more deep true crime breakdowns and real case analysis. Thank you for watching.